Hi everyone, welcome to episode number 44 of the Bill Podcast, and today we'll be going through Node.js, which is a platform for us to create event-driven, non-blocking I/O applications. And also, another popularity of Node.js is due to the fact that along with writing JavaScript for client-side scripting, we can use the very same programming language for server-side. Now, before we dive into some of the features of why Node.js is so popular and useful, let's take a look at some of the important websites. The very first one is obviously the homepage, nodejs.org, and here you will find a very simple installation link for Windows, Mac, or Linux, along with the important API documentation. So this is the documentation that we will keep going back to if we want to understand Node and how it works. And I really like it how it's structured. So for example, if we go to the HTTP documentation under Node, you can also view it as a JSON, which makes things really easy if you want to query it, or even the fact that it is very clearly denoted like, hey, it's stable or it's deprecated, and you can go and explore the various functions. Along with the documentation, I also recommend the Twitter handle for Node.js, which comes with a lot of updates from the team, and two videos. The very first video is actually by the founder of Node.js. Although this was given almost 4 years ago in a conference, I felt going through the video gave us the reason why Node.js should be used, or for what purpose it can be used, specifically for event-driven applications. And the second one is also another video by Ryan Dahl, the founder of Node.js as well, and he kind of goes through a lot of Hello World applications as well as the basic networking and some of the functions that are very important for Node.js. Now, I already have Node.js installed, so if you have that, so if we will just go and query the version, and there you go, I'm running 10.8, which is basically the latest version that came out just about yesterday. Now, when you install Node.js, I believe NPM, which is the Node package manager to manage all the modules for Node, also comes with it. So if you query NPM, there you go, do make sure that you have NPM installed as well. The other thing that I find very useful is a Node version manager. So if you have many installations or rather versions of Node, Node version manager will help us manage it. It's a bit like Ruby version manager or RVM. So do go ahead and install Node version manager as well. So let me go through briefly with you what an NVM is. So if you do NVM ls, you will see a list of installations that are found in your machine. As you can see, currently by default I'm using 0.10.8. Now, before we dive into the coding part of Node, I'd like to kind of say that, well, Node is basically known a lot for server-side JavaScript web application building purpose as well. But for today's episode, I decided to concentrate a little bit on event-driven and non-blocking asynchronous properties of Node, which I feel is the feature that we should be looking out for when building an application that is event-driven. Also, I will touch a little bit on the modules as well as slightly a bit on how networking such as a web server or a TCP server is built right into Node, and it makes it very easy to build this stuff. So instead of focusing on the server side and building in a web application, I thought of learning something new and exploring what exactly is event-driven or a little bit of networking as well. So let's dive straight into that. Now, once you have Node installed, you can actually start it with a Node REPL. So let's do that. All you need to do is come to your command line and type in Node, and it will start with this sort of greater than prompt. And from here on, you can basically type JavaScript. So for example, we do a console log, and it's basically running JavaScript. You can also do something like check the type of an object. So yep, we can actually run a JavaScript code in a REPL, which is pretty cool. It kind of reminds me of Ruby or Python as well. So in order to exit, all we will need to do is just Control C twice. Now, usually we are always used to executing JavaScript in our browser. So if we go to a developer console, for example, I am in the Chrome Dev Console, the global object that we typically find is the window. And when we query window, we will find a lot of functions and objects for us to use. Now in Node, the global object that is available to us is simply called process. So when we query process, notice very similar to window, we will have a lot of information coming to us that we can use. And I am back into my command line. This time I will create a file. So let me just create a file and call it 1-hello.js. Why don't we go ahead and do a very simple console log statement, and I'm gonna say hello world in Node.js. Very simple one. So how can we run this with Node? So all we can do is Node, and then we give the file name and we can execute it. And there you go, we can have hello world in Node. Great, so now that we have installed Node and we kind of know how to run files with Node or even execute some JavaScript using the REPL, let's explore a function of JavaScript, which is the asynchronous function. So I'll go back to my file and create a new folder and call it async. And the very first file that I'll create inside here will be a Ruby file, just to give some comparison with other programming languages. So inside index.rb, the Ruby file, let me just paste in some code. So this is really easy. All I'm doing is requiring the module which is timeout, and I will be putting in the timestamp and calling it before. And then I will sleep or halt the program for about 2 seconds, and then I'll just print out after. So let's see what happens when we do that. So I'll come back to my command line and I will do ruby index.rb, and there you go, the before statement is done and it halted for 2 seconds, and the after. I have specifically denoted the timestamp so that you can see there's a difference between 33 seconds and 5 seconds. Alright, so why don't we go ahead and do the same thing with a Python file. And I'm going to do exactly the same, import some libraries that are necessary, and I'm basically printing before, sleep for 2 seconds, and then after with a similar timestamp. I'm just going to run the video in real time for you to kind of observe that pattern. So Python index before 1-2 seconds and then after. As you can see, it's 30 seconds and then there's 32 seconds. And just for the fun of it, I'll just create a C programming file. So it is index.c. C will be a little bit more verbose, but I have a little command here. As you can see, I have imported some header files, and inside the main function, there you go, I'm printing before with a timestamp and then sleep for 2 seconds and then after. So in order to execute it in the command line, I will call the C compiler clang and then index.c, and immediately I'll just execute it. So notice here, before it pauses for 2 seconds and then after. So whether we are running it in Ruby, Python or C language, you can see the sort of how the program runs. Now why don't we do the same thing with JavaScript? In this case, I'll create a new file called index.js. And over here, I will do very similar thing. So I'll have before with the date stamp. Now I'm only getting the seconds out of it. And then I'll kind of set timeout and delay it. Similarly, it's for 2 seconds and then after. So let's see what happens. So I'm going to run it with Node. So let me clear the command line. Node index.js. And there you go, before after prints immediately and then the 2 seconds. Something funny happened, isn't it? Even though the after statement is after the set timeout command, it is having the same date second stamp, which is in the second of 45, whereas the command for set timeout happens 2 seconds later. Now this very simple example already shows us that JavaScript can execute asynchronously. So let's kind of see a little bit what is happening here. Notice here the set timeout function. Here we have 2 arguments. First one is a function and then second one is the time. Of course, we can expand the function, and this function will be invoked later on, and yet it will be remembered in the context in which it was declared. And this makes JavaScript so easy to program in event-driven ways because of 2 properties. The first one is first class function, And this basically means that we can pass functions as arguments to other functions. And the second one is closure, which basically allows a function to access non-local variables. Hence, this makes JavaScript inherently much easier to program in an event-driven manner. Now, it is also worth noting that other programming languages also has libraries for event-driven processes. For example, Ruby has Event Machine, or Python has Twisted, and Perl has Any Event. So we will come back to this event-driven nature of Node, which stands upon JavaScript, a little bit later. But let's continue learning Node with this thing called modules. So let me create a new folder, and firstly we will create a custom module, which means it is my module. How can we create modules ourselves and then use it in Node? So I'm going to create a very simple module here, and this will basically have a lot of circle functions. So firstly, I'll define what's a pi, and then quickly calculate the area and a circumference, and then I'll export these two functions. So let's say this is a module that is created by me. How can I use it in my program? So for this, let me create a new file called index.js. And inside here, I will require this module. So I will use var and then circle and use the keyword require. And then I will say // and then the file name, which is circle.js. And once I do that, I will simply do a console log statement, and then I will query the module. So in this case, it will be circle.area, and then I will pass in the argument as 4. And I will run node index.js. And there you go. Area with radius 4 is 50.26. Now, this is a pattern of declaring modules, and this has been declared in the CommonJS way of doing so. So do go ahead and check out CommonJS if you want to know how Node implements the modules. Next, we will learn how to include some of the core modules that Node.js already comes with it. As you see here, there are already many modules here, and we are going to use one of the modules, and that is HTTP. And in this way, we will also see how easy it is to create a web server through Node.js. And inside here, I'm going to create a file called server.js. So the very first thing I'll do is var HTTP, which is very similar to what I did with Circle. But this time, as you notice, there's no file. So I can just require it from the core module that comes with Node, and that is HTTP. Next, I will declare a server, and then I'll say http.create server. And in case you're wondering where I got this function from, they are very well defined in the documentation. So there you go, it returns a new web server object. And inside this create server, I will pass in a function. And this function will have two arguments. One is the request parameter and one is a response parameter. And using the response, I will attach a head to it, also pass in some data, and finally I will end it. So first of all, I will search for write head. So there you go. So we can pass in the status code, which will obviously be 200, and then the content type. So let me just copy this for the sake of ease. So I'll just copy and paste this. And next is the write. So let's search for .write. And there you go. So we can just put in a chunk. So I will simply say hello world /n to end it, and then we have .end. So let me just search for .end. The cool thing about .end is this, that it is equivalent to calling response.write followed by .end. So why don't I just pass in the data? It will be much shorter. So I will just go ahead and delete this line. So there you go, it's much shorter. So after this, all I need to do is server.listen. So that'll be 4000 at localhost port 1000. Okay, so that looks good. So why don't we test it out in the command line? So node server.js, and there you go, it is running at localhost port 4000. So let me open a brand new command line. So let me firstly try to curl it. Sorry, there's an error that content.body is not defined. Obviously, it's not an HTML, so I'll just delete it for the sake of simplicity. And let me run it once again, node server.js, curl http localhost, and there you go, hello world. why don't I curl it with some information? Why don't I curl it with some information with the parameter option -I, content type text /plain. And of course, finally, I can even open it in the browser. And once I do that, the familiar hello world is denoted. Now I will quickly do a little bit of cleaning up. As you notice that we will be needing these variables only once, we probably even don't need to declare it. So what I'll do is I will replace HTTP with just require, and instead of server.listen, guess what? I will just chain it here right away. And let me just add in Node.js. Let's stop the server and restart it. And once we refresh, guess what? Hello world in Node.js. As you notice, Node.js framework is so tightly coupled with the networking side of things. With just a few lines, we have created a web server. Finally, I also wanted to say that you can pass in some useful data. For example, here, let's pass in the request URL. So req.url. So I'm gonna stop and start the server once again. And this time when I go into localhost, obviously there's no hello world. But notice here what happens when I do the URL. Yep, there you go. In the data that is passed through, the URL is passed as we have written in the code right here. Some fun bits about Node. So that's a little bit about how we can use the core modules that come with Node.js. Finally, in terms of modules, we will use the external module. So in the external module, we will also very similarly create a web server and serve it through the browser. And this time we will require an external module called connect. So similar syntax. So let's create the server, and we will also end it with hello world in Node. And of course we also need to define the port. So let's have it at port 4000. I'll just do a console log server running, and then node server.js, and there will be an error. It cannot find the module connect, unlike the previous module that we used HTTP, because connect is an external module. How do we install external modules like connect? Now notice the folder here. All we have is one file server.js. In order to install an external module, we will use npm, and then we will say the module name, which is connect. What npm will do is that it will create a folder called node_modules, and it will install the connect module inside there. Node server.js. There you go, it's running. So let's go ahead and look at localhost 4000. Yep, there you go. Hello world in Node.js. Now, connect module has a lot of built-in functionalities, especially for serving up HTML pages. So, for example, here you can pass in an HTML tag. So why don't we try out with h1 tag, the header 1 tags. There is our familiar header 1 tag. There you go. It is actually in HTML. Now, pretty soon you will realize that this is probably not the best way to code. We are mixing the presentation, which is in terms of the DOM elements, together with the server-side code. So why don't we serve up a proper HTML, like a .html file? So connect makes that very easily available. So I'm just going to remove all this and code that out. So I'm going to say connect. Now, this is not enough. What we will have to do is create a new folder called public, and inside the public folder we need to create a file called index.html. Now similarly, you can also link it to CSS files. So let me just create a folder called CSS, and inside that I will have a file called style.css. And just for the simplicity, I'll just say background color. Alright, and obviously I need to come back to index.html and link it up. And when I link it up, I'll say css/style.css. Come back to the browser, and when I refresh, there you go, Node.js with connect module. And when I view the page source, yep, it is all in HTML. So that's a little bit about modules. So there are three ways. Once again, I can create my own custom module. I can create some Node applications using the core modules that comes with Node, or even an external module with npm install. Let me just create server.js, an empty file this time. And let's talk a little bit about scheduling functions in JavaScript. So very similarly, like before, we use set timeout. I am going to have a set timeout, which will just time out in 4 seconds. And I will also have another function, which is set interval. And this will kind of repeat every 2 seconds. Why don't we run this? So I'll say node and then server.js. There you go. It will repeat every 2 seconds, time out in 4 seconds, and it will repeat. And it will obviously never stop. So let me just set variables to each of them. And this time I will create a function which is clear timeout. And I will pass in the repeat variable, which is basically the function for interval. So clear timeout will basically cancel it. So will the repeat statement run? Let's just see what happens. So guess what? It exits and the repeat function never executes because it is cancelled. Now I am showing you a scheduling function just as a demo. But this can basically stand for something like heavy computation in terms of querying database or execute some heavy processing commands with the file system or even the operating system. This is just a simulation to say that this is a process hogging kind of function. But what if we want to execute a function that is a little bit delayed, and this must happen after all the functions on this program has been executed? Well, Node has this little function called process.nextTick. And the very first thing I'll do is a console log statement. Let's run this very simple thing. Let me just split the screen. Great. So once we run it, notice that it will execute immediately. Now in between these two, I will kind of execute an infinite function. So let's see what happens there. So you see before runs and then it gets halted by the program, which is the infinite loop, and the after is never ever executed. So let me just cancel this. Next, instead of the infinite loop, I'm gonna use the Node way of doing it, which is process.nextTick. And inside I will pass in a function and I'll just say tick 1. So let's see what happens here. So let me just run it once again. So before, after, and then tick 1. So interestingly, notice here before executes and then after, and then this function. So once again, this is how we can defer the execution of a certain function until the iteration of the next event loop. Now notice here, I'm going to do the same thing but tick 2 very quickly just for you to get the concept. And there you go. The before happens, this is later, so it puts it up in the queue, then it executes after, and then it puts this up into the queue as well. And then it executes all the process.nextTick functions. And that's why we have tick 1 and tick 2 after the before and after statements. Now, instead of console.log, why don't we create an infinite loop here? So notice here, because the tick 1 is an infinite loop, tick 2 never gets executed. This little example with process.nextTick kind of tells us that we can execute the function and defer it until the next iteration of the event loop. But it also tells us that if we have a very big process hogging kind of function, we probably should not be doing it in this way. So for this, we come to the next concept, which is the parent and the child process. So for this, I will create a brand new file and call it parent.js. And over here, I will initiate a variable and require the module child process. And next, let me execute a command line statement, which is simply ls-al. And I can also pass in an inline function once again. So I'll just check whether there is an error. If not, all I will do is just put it out in standard out. Great. And just to see how the execution happens, I'll just print a before and after statements. Right, great. So let's go ahead and execute node parent.js. Before goes first and then after, and then it executes the child process, which is ls-al. Similarly, instead of a command line statement, we can also execute another node file. So let me just replace this with another command line statement, which is simply node and then the file name, which we will create, called child.js. So just to simulate that this is a process hogging function, I'll just delay it by about a second. And I will also append here the timestamp so that we can understand a little bit more. Right, so let's execute parent.js this time. But in this case, instead of executing a command line statement, it will execute another Node file. Before after is executed approximately around the same time. And then the process hogging statement takes about 2 seconds. Great. So along with the event-driven ways of doing in Node, for example, using process.tick or even parent and child processes, we can see how it makes Node very fast. Finally, we will create a very simple TCP server. This will kind of denote that Node comes tightly coupled with many of the computer networking libraries. The very first thing I will do is require the net module and create server. And I'll also create an array, an empty array, which will later be populated with objects for the sockets. Now, once we set on the server, there are a few things happening. So the server has to do something on connection. Similarly, it also has to do something on error. And finally, it has to do something when we close the TCP chat server. And finally, I will also listen to the server on port 4000. Great, so let's deal with the very first one. So for the very first one, it will pass in the socket parameter. And maybe I'll just do a console log. And very simple, I will just push the new socket into the array. Now, once we have the new socket, two things can happen. The socket can send in data, or the socket can also close the connection. Right, great. So let's expand what happens when the socket initiates a data. So over here, it's another inline function. So let's have the data. So the very first thing that we will do is just console log, and we will say got data. For each of the socket, we will transmit the data. And here we will do a little check. So if I'm the one sending the socket, I do not want to have it back and echoed to myself. So I'll just do a little check. Great. So that's what happens when a data is received. Now what happens when we close it? Just have a little console log statement, and we will delete the socket from the array of sockets. Great, so let's go on to error. Error, there's nothing much, so there is just error with the parameter error, and I'll just spit out the error message. And finally, when there is a close, I will similarly do a console log and just say that, hey, the server is closed. So I have arranged the command line a little bit. So there you go. I will start the chat server here. And let me join the chat server. So netcat localhost 4000. So there you go. New connected. And let me join one more connection here. And another one, new connection. So let me just say hello. And there you go. Got data. And I receive it too. The second user uses it too. And say, hey there. And there you go. You have a very simple TCP chat server. Let me just close it. And we're back in the command line. So that was a little bit about Node.js. As I said, I did not go through the server side, JavaScript side of it, how it allows us to create a web application, because I thought Node's uniqueness is in terms of how we can create event-driven, non-blocking, and asynchronous applications. And I hope through some of the examples here, it has become very clear how Node is also tightly coupled with some of the inbuilt or even custom modules, as well as support for networking such as HTTP or TCP. And finally, before we end, let me briefly go through some of the other Node resources which has helped me a lot. One of them is Node Beginner Book. Once again, this also does not go through a lot with the server side of things, but it goes through really well about the asynchronous and the non-blocking features of Node. I highly recommend this book. The second one is Node.js Professional Book, which is sold in Amazon. And this is created by the same author that does Node.js, which is who is Pedro Teixeira. So I highly recommend you to watch Node.js as well as read through this book. As I said, I didn't go through the server side of things to do with web application building with Node. And Express.js is a very fantastic Node framework that is built on top of Node for us to quickly build web applications. Right, so that's it for this week. And finally, the build link of this week is tech.pro. This is quite a new website, but I'm really loving the quality of tutorials that comes in this website. For example, a lot of web and mobile tutorials. For example, how to do a Ruby gem development. This is, by the way, from the creator of Vagrant. Or even like HTML5, Require.js, very in-depth tutorial. And that's it for this week's episode of Build Podcast. For all other episodes, do check out build-podcast.com and subscribe via one of the 5 channels, which is RSS, GitHub, iTunes, Vimeo, or YouTube, and get your weekly dose of episodes. And that's it for this week's episode of Build Podcast, and I'll see you next week. Goodbye.